The rain was coming down hard that evening. The kind of rain that soaks through your jacket in seconds and makes your shoes feel like wet sponges, but didn't have time to wait for it to stop. He had 3 more deliveries to make, and the last one was at Westfield Academy of Music. He had been doing this job for almost 3 years now. Every single day, he would pick up food orders from restaurants around the city and deliver them to people who were too busy or too important to cook for themselves. It wasn't a glamorous job. The pay was average. The tips were unpredictable, but it kept the lights on at home, and that was all that mattered. Pulled his scooter into the parking lot of the academy and grabbed the food bag. The building in front of him looked more like a mansion than a school. Tall white pillars stood at the entrance. The windows were huge and spotless. Even the grass outside was perfectly trimmed, like someone measured each blade with a ruler. He had been coming here for years, but he never got used to it. This place was a different world. The students who walked these halls came from families with money, real money, the kind of money that could pay $40,000 a year just to learn how to play an instrument. Couldn't even imagine having that much in his bank account. He walked through the front door and the smell hit him immediately. It was that clean, expensive smell, like fresh flowers mixed with polished wood. The floors were so shiny he could see his own reflection. And there he was, a 23-year-old delivery guy in a damp jacket and muddy shoes, walking through a place where everything screamed perfection. He kept his head down and moved quickly. He had learned a long time ago that it was better to be invisible in places like this. The less attention he attracted, the smoother things went. The order was for room 114. He knew the way by heart. Down the main hallway past the big auditorium, then left at the corner. He had made this walk dozens of times before. Sometimes he would hear music floating out from the practice rooms. Piano, violin, cello. Sounds so beautiful they made him stop in his tracks, even when he was in a hurry. Tonight was no different. As he got closer to room 114, he heard it. A piano. Someone was playing a piece he recognized instantly. It was one of the hardest pieces ever written for the instrument. A piece that required fingers to move so fast they almost became a blur. A piece that separated the good players from the truly great ones. But something was wrong. The music kept stumbling. The same section would start and then there would be a pause. Then it would start again. And again. Whoever was playing was struggling badly. Reached room 114 and found the door slightly open. He was about to knock when he glanced inside and froze. The room was large and beautiful. A huge window on one side let in the evening light. Certificates and awards hung on the walls, and right in the center of the room sat a piano that looked like it cost more than everything owned combined. It was a grand piano, black and shiny, the kind you see in concert halls. A teenage boy sat at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. He looked frustrated. His shoulders were tense, and he kept shaking his head after every mistake. Standing next to him was a woman in her 50s. She had silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a dark blazer that looked expensive. Her arms were crossed, and there was a look of impatience on her face. This was Professor, the head of the piano department. Had seen her name on the directory many times. She was supposed to be one of the best piano teachers in the country. Students came from all over just to study under her. The boy tried the passage again. His fingers moved fast, but they landed in all the wrong places. The notes came out jumbled, like a sentence with all the words mixed up. Professor sighed loudly. It was the kind of sigh that made you feel small. Watched from the doorway, still holding the food bag. He knew he should just knock, hand over the delivery, and leave. That was his job, nothing more, nothing less. But he couldn't stop watching, and he couldn't stop listening. The boy tried once more. This time, he got a little further before everything fell apart again. His hands dropped to his lap in frustration. And that's when it happened. Without thinking, without meaning to, whispered something under his breath. It was quiet, barely louder than a breath. But in a room that's silent, even a whisper sounds like a shout. He said, try crossing the fourth finger earlier. It gives you more time for the jump. The moment those words left his mouth, he regretted them. He felt his face go hot. His heart started pounding. What was he thinking? Who was he to say anything? Professor turned her head slowly, like a hawk that had just spotted movement in the grass. Her eyes locked onto. They moved from his wet jacket to his delivery bag to his muddy shoes, and then they came back up to his face. The look she gave him was not friendly. It was the look someone gives when they find a stain on their expensive carpet. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was ice underneath it. Swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just have a delivery for this room." He held up the food bag like it was a shield that could protect him. But Professor didn't look at the bag. She kept her eyes fixed on him. "No," she said slowly. "What did you just say about the fourth finger?" Felt trapped. The boy at the piano had turned around now and was staring at him too. There was a smirk on his face, like he was watching something entertaining. "It was nothing," said quickly. "I was just talking to myself. I'm sorry." "You were talking to yourself about finger technique for one of the most difficult piano pieces ever composed." Professor took a step toward him. "That's quite a conversation to have with yourself." Didn't know what to say. He stood there frozen, feeling smaller by the second. The boy at the piano let out a short laugh. "I think the delivery guy is trying to give us a music lesson," he said. His voice dripped with amusement. A few more faces appeared at the doorway behind. Other students, curious about what was happening. Great. Now he had an audience for his humiliation. Professor tilted her head slightly. "Tell me something. Do you even know what piece he was playing?" Hesitated. Every instinct told him to apologize again and get out of there as fast as possible. But something else was building inside him. A feeling he had pushed down for years. A feeling that was tired of being invisible, tired of being looked at like he was nothing. He met her eyes. "It's called La," he said quietly. "Composed by. It's based on a melody by. The section he's struggling with is one of the hardest parts. The jumps between the notes are so wide that most pianists can't do them cleanly without years of practice." The smirk on the boy's face disappeared. Professor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something between surprise and suspicion. The students at the doorway had gone completely silent and stood there, heart pounding, wondering what he had just started. The silence in that room felt heavy. It pressed down on from all sides, making it hard to breathe. He could feel everyone's eyes on him. The professor, the student at the piano, the small crowd that had gathered at the doorway. They were all staring at him like he had just grown a second head. Professor uncrossed her arms slowly. She took another step toward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. There was something dangerous in the way she moved, like a cat that had cornered a mouse and was deciding what to do with it. "So," she said, her voice smooth and cold, "the delivery boy knows about." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And the way she said "delivery boy" made it sound like something dirty, like something to be ashamed of. Felt his face burn. He wanted to disappear. He wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole, but he couldn't move. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The boy at the piano turned around fully on the bench now. His name was, though didn't know that. He was 17 years old, came from one of the richest families in the city, and had been playing piano since before he could read. His father had donated a new wing to this academy just last year. In this building was royalty. And right now, royalty was looking at like he was a joke. "This is actually hilarious," said, leaning back on the piano bench. "A delivery guy trying to teach me how to play. What's next? The janitor giving lectures on music theory." A few students at the doorway laughed. It was that kind of laugh that people do when they want to fit in, when they want to be on the winning side. Gripped the food bag. The plastic handle dug into his fingers. "I wasn't trying to teach anyone," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I just made a comment. It slipped out. I'm sorry." "But that's the interesting part," Professor said. She hadn't taken her eyes off him. "Your comment wasn't wrong. In fact, it was quite accurate. The fourth finger technique you mentioned is exactly what separates amateur attempts from professional execution of that passage." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "Which makes me wonder," she continued, "where exactly did a food delivery person learn such specific technical knowledge about classical piano?" "Said nothing. What could he say? The truth was too long and too painful to explain in this room full of strangers who had already decided he was beneath them." Professor seemed to take his silence as an invitation to continue. "Let me guess," she said, a thin smile forming on her lips. "You watched some videos online, maybe read a few articles. Perhaps you stumbled across a documentary about famous pianists and now you think you understand music." More laughter from the doorway, louder this time. His jaw tightened. He could feel something building inside him, something hot and sharp. He had spent his whole life swallowing moments like this, moments where people looked at him and saw only his circumstances, only his job, only his worn-out clothes and tired face. He had learned to keep quiet, to nod and smile and move on, because fighting back never helped, because people like him didn't get to fight back. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the rain that had soaked through to his skin. Maybe it was the 3 years of walking through these halls feeling invisible. Maybe it was the way that boy at the piano laughed, like his entire existence was entertainment. Whatever it was, it made him lift his head and look Professor straight in the eyes. "I didn't learn from videos," he said quietly. The room went still again. Professor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, then where did you learn?" Hesitated. He knew he should stop. He knew he should just apologize one more time, drop off the food and leave, go back to his scooter, finish his deliveries, go home to his small apartment and forget this night ever happened. But the words came out anyway. "I learned the same way your students learn," he said, "by practicing, every day for years." Snorted, "Right, and where exactly did you practice?" "On a toy keyboard from the dollar store." Professor said sharply, but there was no real scolding in her voice. She was too curious about what would say next. The crowd at the doorway had grown. There were maybe 15 students now, all watching like this was the most interesting thing that had happened all semester. A few of them had their phones out, recording. Notice the phones. Great. If this went badly, it would probably end up on the internet by morning. The delivery guy who embarrassed himself at the fancy music school. Another joke for people to share and laugh at. But he was already in too deep to back out now. "I used to play," he said, "a long time ago, before I started this job." Professor's expression shifted slightly. The mocking edge softened, replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. "Used to play," she repeated. "Past tense, so you quit." "I didn't quit," said. The words came out harder than he intended. "I just couldn't continue. There's a difference." "Is there?" Professor tilted her head. "Because from where I stand, the result is the same. You're not a pianist anymore. You're someone who delivers food. And yet you walk into my classroom and try to correct my student." Felt the sting of her words. She wasn't entirely wrong. He wasn't a pianist anymore. He hadn't performed in years. Hadn't sat at a proper piano in longer than he could remember. Whatever he used to be, that person felt like a stranger now. But she wasn't entirely right either, because music doesn't just leave you. It stays in your blood, in your fingers, in the way you hear the world. "I wasn't trying to correct anyone," said again. "I heard him struggling and the words just came out. It won't happen again." He held out the food bag toward. "Your order, paid online, no signature needed." Didn't take the bag. He just sat there looking at with a strange expression, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "You know what?" said, glancing at Professor. "I think we should give him a chance to prove himself." Professor frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Gestured toward the piano, the massive, gleaming instrument that probably cost more than would earn in 10 years of delivering food. "He says he used to play. He says he knows so much about technique, so let's see it." Stood up from the bench and stepped aside. "Go ahead, delivery guy. Show us what you've got." The students at the doorway started murmuring. Some of them looked excited, others looked uncomfortable, but none of them looked away. Professor studied for a long moment. He expected her to shut this down, to tell to stop being ridiculous and let the delivery person leave. Instead, she gestured toward the piano bench. "Well," she said, "you heard him. You seem to have opinions about how this piece should be played, so play it." It was a trap. Knew it was a trap. They expected him to fail. They expected him to sit down at that beautiful instrument and make a fool of himself. They expected to laugh at him, record his humiliation, and have a funny story to tell their friends. This was his chance to walk away, to be smart, to protect whatever dignity he had left. He looked at the piano, at its perfect black surface reflecting the lights above, at the keys that seemed to glow white against the darkness. He had dreamed about pianos like this, back when he was young and still believed his life would turn out differently, back when music was everything to him. The food bag was still in his hand. His uniform was still damp from the rain. His shoes were still leaving small, muddy prints on the expensive floor. He didn't belong here. Everyone in the room knew it. He knew it most of all. But his feet started moving anyway. He walked past, who stepped back with a surprised look on his face. He walked toward the piano bench, feeling every pair of eyes following him. Professor watched him with an unreadable expression. The students held their phones higher, ready to capture whatever happened next, and sat down at the piano. The piano bench felt cool beneath him, smooth and solid, like it had been waiting there for 100 years, patient and unchanging. Placed his hands on his knees and just sat there for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. His palms were sweating. The food bag sat on the floor next to him, a reminder of who he really was, not a musician, not a performer, just a guy who brought people their dinner. What was he doing? What on earth was he thinking? He could still get up. He could still apologize, grab the bag, and walk out of here. Sure, people would laugh. Sure, they would call him a coward, but at least he wouldn't embarrass himself even more by trying to play and failing miserably. Because what if he couldn't do it anymore? What if his fingers had forgotten everything? It had been so long, so incredibly long since he had touched a real piano like this one. The room behind him was completely silent. He could feel everyone watching, waiting. Some of them probably had their phones ready to record the moment he made a fool of himself. This would be the highlight of their week. The delivery guy who thought he could play piano at one of the best music academies in the country. Professor stood a few feet away, her arms crossed again. Her face gave nothing away. She looked like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict she had already decided. Had moved to the side of the room, leaning against the wall with that same smug expression on his face. He caught his eye and gave a little nod, as if to say, "Go ahead. We're all waiting for the show." Turned back to face the piano. The keys stretched out in front of him like a road he used to know by heart. 88 keys, black and white, simple in appearance, but capable of producing sounds that could make people laugh or cry or feel things they couldn't put into words. He had loved these keys once, more than almost anything else in the world. Slowly, he lifted his hands from his knees and held them over the keyboard. His fingers trembled slightly. He noticed how rough they looked now, calloused from gripping handlebars in all kinds of weather, in a few places from minor accidents over the years. These were not the hands of a pianist anymore. These were the hands of a worker. He heard someone whisper behind him, Then a soft laugh quickly muffled. They were already making fun of him, and he hadn't even played a single note yet. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was stupid. Maybe he should just accept that some chapters of your life close forever, and no amount of wishing can open them again. His hands started to lower back down. But then something happened. A memory surfaced, uninvited, unexpected, but so vivid it almost knocked the breath out of him. He was 12 years old again, sitting at an old upright piano in his family's small apartment. The instrument was nothing special. Some of the keys stuck. The sound was slightly out of tune, but to Young, it was the most magical thing in the world. His mother stood in the kitchen doorway watching him practice. She had just come home from her second job of the day. Her feet were swollen, her eyes were tired, but she was smiling. "Play the one I like," she had said. And he had played for her. A simple melody at first, then something more complex. And as the music filled their tiny apartment, he watched the exhaustion fade from her face. For those few minutes, she wasn't a woman working herself to the bone to keep them afloat. She was just his mother, happy and peaceful, listening to her son create something beautiful. That was the power of music. It could transport people. It could heal them, even if just for a moment. Blinked, and he was back in the present. Back in this fancy room with its judgmental audience and its impossible expectations. But something had shifted inside him. He wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't doing this to prove anything to Professor or to shut up that arrogant kid who looked at him like garbage. He wasn't even doing this for himself. He was doing this for the 12-year-old boy who had dreams. The boy who used to believe that music could take him anywhere. The boy who had to give up everything he loved so that his family could survive. That boy deserved to be heard, just once more. Straightened his back. He adjusted his position on the bench, shifting slightly until it felt right, until it felt like it used to. Professor noticed. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. Adjusting the bench height and position was something trained pianists did instinctively. It was such a small detail, but it meant something. It meant he had done this before, many times. The whispers behind him stopped. Looked down at the keys. He let his fingers hover just above them, close enough to feel the faint coolness rising from the ivory. He knew what he was going to play. There was only one choice, really. The same piece that had started all of this. The piece had been struggling with. One of the most technically demanding works in the entire piano repertoire. It was insane to attempt it. After years without proper practice, without access to a real instrument, his muscle memory had probably faded. His speed was probably gone. His precision was probably a shadow of what it used to be. But something deep inside him whispered that it was still there. Buried, maybe. Rusty, definitely. But not gone, not completely. Music like that doesn't just disappear. It becomes part of you. It lives in your bones, in your blood, in the way your fingers remember shapes and patterns even when your mind has moved on. He closed his eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath. Behind him, a student shifted their weight from one foot to another. The small sound echoed in the silence like a thunderclap. Professor uncrossed her arms and let them fall to her sides. For the first time, there was something other than judgment on her face, something that almost looked like anticipation. Pushed himself off the wall and stood up straight, his smug smile starting to fade. There was something about the way the delivery guy was sitting at the piano now, something different, something serious. Took one long, deep breath. He thought about his mother, who had sacrificed so much. He thought about the years of delivering food in rain and heat and cold, dreaming of a different life. He thought about every person who had ever looked at him and seen nothing worth noticing. Then he let all of it go. His mind went quiet. His hands stopped trembling. The nervous energy that had been buzzing through his body transformed into something else, something focused and calm. This was the moment before the storm. The pause between lightning and thunder. 3 seconds passed. They felt like an eternity. And then opened his eyes, lowered his fingers to the keys, and began to play. The first note rang out, pure and clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. And in that instant, everything changed. The first note hit the air like a drop of water falling into a still pond. Clean, perfect. It spread through the room in ripples that seemed to touch everyone present. Then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly the music began to flow. His fingers moved across the keys with a certainty that surprised even him. It was like reuniting with an old friend after years apart, awkward for just a moment and then completely natural, like no time had passed at all. The opening melody of La filled the room. It was soft at first, delicate, mimicking the sound of tiny bells ringing in the distance. This was the part that gave the piece its name. La meant the little bell in Italian, and right now, those bells were singing. Professor's expression changed. It was subtle at first, a slight parting of her lips, a small crease forming between her eyebrows. She had heard this piece performed hundreds of times by students of all skill levels. She knew within the first few measures whether someone truly understood the music or was just going through the motions. This delivery boy understood it. The students at the doorway had gone completely still. The ones holding phones forgot to keep them steady. One girl lowered her device entirely, too captivated to care about recording anymore. Stood frozen against the wall. The smirk that had lived on his face for the past 15 minutes was gone. In its place was something he rarely felt. Confusion. How was this possible? How was a guy in a stained delivery uniform playing better than had ever played in his life? Didn't see any of this. His eyes were focused on the keys, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was lost in the music, swimming in it, letting it carry him to places he hadn't visited in years. The piece began to build. The gentle bells gave way to faster passages, more complex rhythms. This was where most pianists started to struggle. The notes came so quickly that your fingers had to move almost faster than thought. One tiny hesitation, one small mistake, and the whole thing would collapse like a house of cards. His fingers flew. They danced across the black and white keys with a speed that seemed almost impossible. Years of muscle memory came flooding back, stronger than he had dared to hope. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. A student near the back of the crowd whispered, "Oh my God." Professor took a step closer to the piano. Then another. Her arms hung loose at her sides now. The coldness that had defined her face since walked in was melting away, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. The music grew more intense, hit the section that had given so much trouble, the wide jumps between notes, the lightning-fast runs up and down the keyboard, the part that required not just technical skill but true artistry. He didn't just play it correctly, he played it beautifully. His left hand anchored the melody while his right hand leaped across octaves like it was nothing. The notes rang out clear and true, each one landing exactly where it should, exactly when it should. There were no stumbles, no hesitations, just pure, flowing music. A girl standing in the doorway felt tears forming in her eyes. She didn't even know why. The music was just hitting something deep inside her, something she couldn't explain or control. She wasn't the only one. An older student, a violinist who had been at the academy for 4 years, felt a lump forming in his throat. He had heard world-famous pianists perform this piece. Some of them hadn't moved him the way this delivery boy was moving him right now. Because there was something different about the way he played, something raw and honest. He wasn't performing for applause or grades or approval. He was playing like a man who had been holding his breath for years and was finally allowed to exhale. Every note carried emotion, the joy of reunion, the pain of loss, the hope that refuses to die no matter how hard life tries to crush it. All of it poured out through those 88 keys, filling the room with something that felt almost sacred. Professor brought her hand to her chest without realizing it. In 30 years of teaching, she had encountered maybe a handful of students with this kind of gift. Natural talent combined with deep emotional understanding. Technique that served the music instead of showing off. The ability to make listeners feel rather than just hear. She was looking at that gift right now, in the most unlikely package imaginable. The piece reached its climax. The music swelled bigger and bigger like a wave building before it crashes on the shore. His whole body moved with the piano now. He swayed slightly, his shoulders rising and falling, his head nodding with the rhythm. He wasn't just playing the instrument anymore. He had become part of it. The final cascade of notes came rushing down like a waterfall of sound, fast and furious and absolutely breathtaking. His fingers were a blur, moving so quickly they seemed to multiply. The room filled with music so intense it was almost overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The last note rang out, high and clear, hanging in the air like a question. Held it for a moment, letting it fade naturally, letting the silence that followed become part of the performance. His hands lifted from the keys and came to rest in his lap. It was over. The room stayed completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was like everyone had forgotten how to do anything except stand there and process what they had just witnessed. 5 seconds passed, 10, 15. Stared at the piano keys. He was breathing hard like he had just run a marathon. His heart was pounding, but not from fear anymore. From something else entirely. From the overwhelming feeling of coming home after a very long journey. He had done it. After all these years, after all the doubt and struggle and sacrifice, he had sat down at a real piano and played. Really played. And it had been everything he remembered and more. The silence stretched on. It was starting to become uncomfortable. Suddenly became very aware of where he was and what had just happened. He was a delivery boy who had just played a master-level piece on a $200,000 piano in front of one of the most respected music professors in the country. What was he supposed to do now? Stand up and take a bow, apologize for taking up their time, grab his food bag and quietly leave? He turned around slowly on the bench, finally facing his audience. What he saw made him freeze. Professor was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Her eyes were shining. Was she angry, impressed, about to throw him out? The students at the doorway looked like statues. Most of them had their mouths slightly open. A few of them were visibly emotional, wiping at their eyes or blinking rapidly. And the confident, smug, wealthy student who had mocked just minutes ago. He stood against the wall looking like someone had just told him everything he believed about the world was wrong. His face was pale. His hands were shaking slightly. The silence continued. Then, from somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone started clapping. It was slow at first, one pair of hands coming together, breaking the spell that had fallen over the room. Then another person joined in, and another, and suddenly the whole crowd was applauding. Not polite applause, not the kind of clapping you do when you're being courteous. This was real, enthusiastic, the kind of applause that comes from deep in your gut when you've just experienced something extraordinary. A few people cheered, someone let out a whistle. And Professor, the Ice Queen of Westfield Academy, the woman who had made students cry with her harsh critiques, took a step toward the piano and asked a question that changed everything. "Who are you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you really?" The applause slowly faded. The room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not tense or judgmental, just waiting. Everyone wanted to hear the answer to Professor's question. Sat on the piano bench, his hands still resting in his lap. He looked at all the faces staring at him. Just minutes ago, these same faces had looked at him with mockery and dismissal. Now they looked at him with curiosity, with respect. Some of them even looked at him with something close to awe. It felt strange. He had spent so long being invisible that he didn't quite know what to do with all this attention. Professor took another step closer. Her voice was gentle now, nothing like the cold tone she had used before. "Please," she said, "I need to understand. Playing like that doesn't come from watching videos or reading books. That kind of skill takes years of serious training. Where did you study? Who taught you?" Was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands, those rough, calloused hands that had just created something beautiful. "I started playing when I was 5, he said finally. His voice was soft and everyone leaned in slightly to hear. "My grandmother had an old piano. It was out of tune and some of the keys didn't work properly, but I loved it. I would sit at that piano for hours, just figuring things out on my own." He paused, remembering. "When I was 7, a teacher at my school heard me play during a lunch break. I was just messing around on the piano in the music room. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She talked to my parents and convinced them to get me proper lessons." Professor nodded slowly. "And who was your teacher?" "His name was Nair." A gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Professor's eyes widened. "Nair," she repeated. "The Nair. He was one of the greatest pianists this country has ever produced." Nodded. "He lived in our neighborhood. He had retired from performing by then, but he still taught a few students. When he heard me play, he offered to teach me for free. He said he saw something in me." The room was completely silent now. Everyone was hanging on every word. "I trained with him for 6 years," continued. "Every day after school, I would go to his house and practice for hours. He pushed me hard, harder than anyone had ever pushed me, but he also believed in me. He told me I had a gift that could take me anywhere in the world." His voice caught slightly, and he had to stop for a moment. "When I was 12, I won the National Young Musicians Competition. It was the proudest day of my life. My mother was in the audience, crying happy tears. My father took the day off work just to be there. And my teacher, he stood in the back of the hall with this big smile on his face." Professor's expression had changed completely. There was no trace of the cold, dismissive woman from before. She looked at like she was seeing him for the first time. "I remember that competition," she said quietly. "I was one of the judges that year. The winner was a young boy who played Chopin with more emotion than pianists twice his age." She paused. "That was you." Nodded. "But then what happened?" Professor asked. "A talent like that doesn't just disappear. Why did you stop?" The question hung in the air. Felt the old familiar pain rising in his chest. The pain he had tried so hard to bury over the years. "After the competition, I was offered a full scholarship to this academy," he said. "Everything was set. My bags were packed. My parents had tears in their eyes when they dropped me off at the train station." He took a deep breath. "But I never got on that train, because that same week my father collapsed at work. He had been hiding his illness from us for months, not wanting to worry anyone. By the time we found out, it was serious, really serious." A few people in the crowd lowered their eyes. They could feel where this story was going. "The medical bills piled up fast. My mother was already working 2 jobs, but it wasn't enough. We were drowning. And I was just a kid with a piano scholarship, watching my family fall apart." Looked up at the ceiling, blinking back the moisture in his eyes. "So I made a choice. I gave up the scholarship. I dropped out of school and started working. Delivery jobs mostly, anything that would bring in money. I was 13 years old." The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. "My father passed away 2 years later," said. "He never got to see me perform again. But before he died, he made me promise something. He made me promise that I would keep playing somehow, that I wouldn't let the music die completely." He looked down at his hands again. "I tried to keep that promise. I would sneak into churches late at night to use their pianos. I bought a broken keyboard from a pawn shop and fixed it myself. I practiced whenever I could, wherever I could, but it was never the same. Life kept getting in the way." He finally looked up at Professor. I've been delivering food to this academy for 3 years now. Every time I walk through these halls and hear students playing, a part of me aches, because I know that could have been me, should have been me. But life doesn't always give you what you deserve. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Several students were wiping tears from their faces. Even, who had been so smug and dismissive before, looked shaken. Professor stood very still for a long moment. Then she did something no one expected. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers. I owe you an apology, she said. When you walked in here tonight, I saw a delivery uniform. I saw muddy shoes and a food bag. I didn't see you. And that was my failure, not yours. Didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like this before, not in a very long time. Your talent hasn't gone anywhere, Professor continued. What you just played proved that. The question is, what do we do about it now? She turned to look then at the crowd of students. I think we all learned something important tonight, she said. Talent doesn't care about your job title or your bank account. It doesn't care what clothes you wear or where you come from. True ability shines through no matter what. She turned back to, I want you to come back here, not as a delivery person. As a student, I will personally arrange a full scholarship. You'll have access to our practice rooms, our instruments, our resources, everything you should have had years ago. Stared at her in disbelief. But I'm 23 years old. I've been out of school for a decade. I can't just. You can, Professor interrupted firmly. Age is just a number. What matters is what's in here. She touched her chest. And after what I just heard, I can tell you that what's in there is extraordinary. The crowd began to applaud again. This time it was even louder, mixed with cheers and excited voices. Sat there on the piano bench, overwhelmed. His eyes were blurry with tears he couldn't hold back anymore. He thought about his father, about the promise he had made all those years ago, about all the late nights practicing on broken keyboards and borrowed pianos. It hadn't been for nothing. 3 weeks later, a video from that night went viral. Someone had recorded the whole thing and posted it online. Within days, millions of people had watched the delivery boy sit down at a grand piano and play like a master. News outlets picked up the story. Messages of support poured in from around the world. Famous musicians shared the video and praised talent. But the numbers and the fame didn't matter to him. What mattered was that he was back where he belonged, back at a piano, back in a world that had once forgotten him. Today performs on stages across the country, but every year he returns to Westfield Academy, not as a delivery boy, not even as a former student, as a teacher. And every time a new class begins, he shares the same lesson with his students, the same lesson he learned on a rainy evening when he walked into a room full of people who thought they knew everything about him. Never look down on anyone, he tells them. The person serving your coffee might paint better than any artist you know. The janitor cleaning your floors might speak 5 languages. The delivery boy bringing your dinner might just be the most talented musician you'll ever meet. He pauses and smiles. Talent doesn't wear labels, and dreams don't have expiration dates. Remember that. And every single time, the room falls silent. Because some lessons don't come from textbooks. They come from life.